This is the Music History In-Depth podcast for July 10th through the 16th. On this week's show, we discuss an event that was laced with racial undertones that became a riot that killed disco, a concert event for the ages, and we say happy birthday to the mother of the MP3. In order to understand the importance of what happened on July 12th, 1979, you first have to understand the context of the times. Back in the 1950s, rock and roll suffered a lot of racial backlash, especially when white kids started liking what was then considered black music. The same thing happened in the 1980s when rap music burst onto the scene. The same thing happened to disco. The genre started in the underground black, Latino, and gay clubs in New York City back in the 1960s, but really started to spread to other clubs in other cities in the 1970s. Disco songs like Van McCoy's The Hustle and artists like Donna Summer were getting airplay on R&B and certain pop radio stations and making the Billboard charts. But, much like rap music back then, there wasn't a huge tidal wave. That all changed once the movie Saturday Night Fever came out on December 12, 1977. The movie became a huge hit, and the soundtrack for it became one of the biggest-selling soundtrack albums of all time, coming in second with 40 million copies to Whitney Houston's Bodyguard soundtrack at 50 million and counting. The Bee Gees became the biggest recording artists of the era, disco clubs opened up, and everyone started learning all of the disco moves, like the hustle. Roller rinks, which were a thing back in the day, switched their music over from playing rock and pop songs to playing disco songs. You couldn't get away from disco if you tried. Everyone and everything was trying to cash in on the disco trend. Everything had a disco theme. Watch old episodes of the TV shows Chips and The Love Boat, for example. Even they had disco theme songs. On the Billboard charts, disco ruled. Much like how EDM songs took over the charts about a decade ago, for a little while anyway, disco did the exact same thing. A lot of local rock and pop music radio stations changed their formats over to disco and put out disco top 10 lists. In short, disco took over the mainstream. Rock and pop artists had chart-topping songs with disco beats. Rod Stewart had Do You Think I'm Sexy? The Rolling Stones did Miss You. Kiss did I Was Made for Loving You. Queen did Another One Bites the Dust. Even soft rock, easy listening guru Barry Manilow had a disco song called Copacabana, which was also a smash hit. And yet, despite its global popularity, it was still looked at by a lot of people in America as black, Latino, and gay music that had taken over the music and pop culture landscape from corporate rock groups that had been popular up to that point. And some people, well, they just did not like that. Kind of like today's atmosphere, really. The media also helped to fuel the fire by emphasizing the gay culture in disco, and not in a good way. After disco music won a bunch of major awards at the 1979 Grammy Awards, people's fears about disco completely taking over reached a fever pitch. Disco became that era's culture war, and something had to be done. And that something was what led to the events that happened on July 12th, 1979. Earlier in 1979 in Chicago, Illinois, two local DJs, Steve Dahl and Gary Meyer, were angry. Dahl had recently switched radio stations to rock radio WLUP because his old radio station, WDAI-FM, was one of those aforementioned radio stations that switched formats from rock to disco. To add insult to injury, WDAI had fired Steve on Christmas Eve. I don't care who you are, but firing someone on Christmas Eve is never a good look. He famously mocked his old radio station, WDAI's slogan, Disco DAI, and called it Disco DIE. How very Elon Musk of him. Steve organized his listeners into an ad hoc group called the Cohos, whose sole mission was to eradicate the quote-unquote disease known as disco. They held anti-disco events that sometimes got a little out of control. For instance, when a club switched from disco back to rock music in June of 1979, Steve and 1,000 of his Cohos members showed up to voice their support. So did a bunch of cops who had a hard time keeping the unruly crowd in line. Later that month, Steve occupied a teen disco, and by occupy, I mean he took over the club with over 7,000 of his Cohos group. One time, his old station, WDAI, was doing a promotion at a newly opened disco. Steve and a bunch of his Cohos showed up, threw a bunch of marshmallows at the promotional van, and then chased the van as the WDAI crew were trying to get away until the van was finally cornered in a park and couldn't leave. Thankfully, no one was injured. On July 6, 1979, Van McCoy, whose smash hit single The Hustle was considered the first disco song to hit #1 on the Billboard Singles Chart and also had a big dance that went with it, passed away. Steve, being the classy guy that he is, celebrated his death by breaking his record on air. Stay classy, Steve. Stay classy. In this day and age, all of this harassment and borderline assault would have gotten Steve fired. Well, maybe not in this particular day and age, but it might have gotten him more than a few lawsuits and probably even arrested. But, this was 1979 and a lot of people hated disco and everything that it stood for, so I guess no harm, no foul. In fact, similar things were happening in other cities. For instance, a radio DJ in Portland, Oregon, held an event where he destroyed disco records with a chainsaw. In Seattle, Washington, someone had an event with a mobile dance floor. Hundreds of disco haters showed up and protested the event. Wow, does all this sound like 2025 or what? One day, Steve and his DJ partner, Gary Meyer, came up with an idea. Roll over disco records with a steamroller like most radio station publicity stunts? Nah, too easy. A chainsaw like the guy in Portland? Nah, come on, this Chicago, think bigger. Why not protest disco by blowing up disco records? Now you're hitting me in all my feels. If only they had a place and a huge audience to do it. Enter Mike Veek. Mike was a baseball executive with the American League baseball team, the Chicago White Sox. He was also the son of White Sox baseball team owner Bill Veek, who was famous for doing crazy publicity stunts, such as having a man who was only 4 foot tall at bat in order for pitchers to not be able to pitch to him properly. Clever. Anyway, after the White Sox came to the radio station looking to do promotions with them, the station came to Mike with their publicity stunt idea. There was a doubleheader scheduled on July 12, 1979 between the Chicago White Sox and the Detroit Tigers, as the two teams needed to make up a game that had been rained out on May 2nd. The White Sox, who only 2 years earlier had done a disco night promotion, were, let's just say, not good. On the day of the promotion, their record was 40 wins and 47 losses. The Detroit Tigers were slightly better, but didn't have a winning record either, with 42 wins and 44 losses. The original idea was to blow up the records in a shopping mall parking lot. But what if, between games, and I'm just spitballing here, the radio station blew up disco records on the baseball field? Ooh. Mike Veek jumped at that chance, but then he doubled down on it. What if he gave a huge discount on tickets to the second game so people would stick around? What if he then made the price 98 cents if they brought a disco record to the game so that it could be blown up? They all figured that the normal capacity for Comiskey Park, where the White Sox played, was about 15,000. Maybe they'd get a few thousand more people to show up. The deal was made, the stage was set, and the promotional announcements were made on the radio station. Come one, come all. We'll be wild. It turned out that more people showed up to the park that day than they figured. About 33,000 more people. They had expected 15,000 because that was how many people had been showing up to the games because the White Sox weren't exactly spectacular. Comiskey Park held 44,492 people at capacity. Park security that day could handle maybe 35,000. They got 47,795 people. 20,000 of them were in the park and another 28,000 of them milled around on the exterior of the park. Bill Veeck, who was in the hospital that day for routine tests, checked himself out of the hospital once he heard just how many people showed up, as he had an idea, according to him, that this wasn't going to end well. Let's see here. Way too many people showing up, lots of liquor on a hot summer day, also explosions, plus a crowd of people who had a history of violence in his cohos. Okay, what could possibly go wrong? I mean, really? Yeah, turns out plenty. The first game of the doubleheader started at 6 o'clock in the evening. The first pitch was thrown out by Lorelei, who was the scantily clad woman who was in the radio station promotional material. The Tigers won that game 4-1, by the way. Pat Underwood was the winning pitcher for the Tigers, bringing his record to 4-0, while Fred Howard was the losing pitcher for the White Sox, bringing his record to 1-4. The game lasted 2 hours and 38 minutes. During the game, though, security got wind that a lot of the fans who didn't have tickets were trying to break into the stadium, so field security went to help out. That left the field unprotected, which also led to what happened after the game. The fans brought so many records to the game that they overflowed the crates that were going to be used for the demolition. A lot of the records weren't even disco records at all. They were just records that were done by black artists. Sure, they had Donna Summer records, but they also had Stevie Wonder records, and Stevie wasn't even a disco artist. They also had black country music superstar Charlie Pride's records in, and he was about as far removed from disco as possible without being a classical music artist. Because of those variables, a lot of people thought that this was more than an anti-disco event, but rather an anti-black, Latino, and gay event. Since some of the records weren't collected at the gates, some fans started tossing them around like they were frisbees, which endangered everyone around them, including the players. Some players even wore their batting helmets while playing in the field so they wouldn't suffer any injuries from the flying vinyl. Other fans outside the stadium took their records, put them in a pile, and lit them on fire, creating a bonfire. Then, the main event. While White Sox pitcher Ken Krevik was on the pitcher's mound warming up for his start for the second game, and with other White Sox players in the dugout milling around, the two DJs and Lorelei, the scantily clad woman in the promotional material, went out to center field in a Jeep. The records were brought out onto the field, the dynamite was placed around the records, the DJs riled up the crowd with a "Disco Sucks" chant, and the records were exploded, tearing a hole in the center field grass. Guess they didn't think of that ahead of time. What followed after that could only be called a riot. Fans poured out onto the field. They tore up the field, and then they tore up the stadium. Seats, part of the stadium wall, if it existed in the park and outside of it, it was getting vandalized. People then started setting what was left of the records on fire on the field, and soon they had a few bonfires going. All this time, there were announcements and stadium signs flashing, telling people to calmly get back to their seats. Yeah, like that was going to work. Even legendary announcer Harry Carey, who was working the game that day, could not get people to calm down. If you tried to escape the park at any point from the end of the first game because you felt that things were getting a little out of control, you were out of luck. Because of the original disturbances during the first game, security had padlocked all except for one exit. At 9:08 p.m., almost 20 minutes after the whole debacle started, Chicago police showed up in full riot gear to restore order. The White Sox still wanted to play the second game, but Detroit Tigers manager Sparky Anderson did not even want his guys playing in case the crowd turned on them. Plus, the field was so torn up because of the riot, there was no possible way anyone was going to play that second game. The second game was canceled, and Major League Baseball's front office told the Chicago White Sox that they had to forfeit the game. As far as the players in this little drama, actually not much happened. The morning after the riot, Steve Dahl and his partner got on their radio broadcast and made fun of the nasty headlines that the local newspapers had printed about what happened. They kept their jobs and are still local media personalities, with Steve now having a podcast of his own called the Steve Dahl Podcast. A lot of people blamed what happened on beer and drugs, as a lot of people had been smoking pot apparently. You know, I don't really know too many people who smoke pot and decide to riot, unless it's because they can't find a bag of munchies, I guess. Bill Veeck eventually sold the Chicago White Sox to Jerry Reinsdorf, who also owned the Chicago Bulls during the Michael Jordan era. Bill Veeck sadly passed away in 1986. Bill's son, Mike, felt that Major League Baseball had blackballed him, as he couldn't get a job in baseball for quite some time. It led to bouts of depression and alcohol abuse, according to him anyway. He eventually ended up buying minor league baseball teams. And for the record, yes, he did hold more events like Disco Demolition Night. In fact, in 2014, one of his baseball clubs held a night where they destroyed Justin Bieber and Miley Cyrus items because some people never learned their lessons, I guess. As far as the racial aspect to it all, Steve Dahl denies that race played a factor for his part in all of this, saying in an op-ed in a local newspaper that, quote, "The worst thing is people calling Disco Demolition homophobic or racist. It just wasn't. We weren't thinking like that," end quote. And that to him it was, quote, "a romp, not of major cultural significance," end quote. I'm actually willing to give him the benefit of the doubt when it comes to his particular thoughts about it. However, that does not even remotely apply to a lot of other people who were at the game. Among them was WMAQ television political journalist Mark W. Anderson, who was a 15-year-old kid when he attended that game. In a rebuke to Steve Dahl's newspaper piece, Anderson wrote, quote, "The chance to yell 'disco sucks' meant more than simply a musical style choice. It was a chance to push back on a whole set of social dynamics that lay just beneath the surface of a minor battle between a DJ and a radio station that decided to change formats. More importantly, it was a chance for a whole lot of people to say they did not like the way the world was changing around them, or who they saw as the potential victors in a cultural and demographic war," end quote. Wow, 2025, only, 40 some odd years ago? 45 by now? Plus, when people are bringing in albums by black artists to burn, regardless of whether they were disco artists or not, you kind of can't help but think that there was at least a little racial element to all of this, whether Steve meant it to be or not. If a lot of this feels like the anti-diversity movement of the mid-2020s, you're probably not wrong. In fact, I would say you're definitely correct. Two more fun facts about this little sort of event that actually have nothing to do with music. First, while it was the last American League game to be forfeited due to a promotional stunt that went awry, it was not the last Major League Baseball game to be forfeited. That dishonor goes to the 1995 Los Angeles Dodgers, who had to forfeit a game on August 10, 1995 against the St. Louis Cardinals due to a baseball giveaway promotion that got so nuts that we're not even going to get into it here because it's got nothing to do with music. But think about it. Baseball promotion, baseball getting thrown, yeah, not a good look. The other fun fact is that someone who later became famous in the world of entertainment was on the field during the Disco Demolition Night riot and participated in the rioting. A then 21-year-old aspiring actor got onto the field, and while the riot was going on, he slid into third base, stole a bat from out of one of the dugouts, and also had his silver belt buckle stolen. This particular actor eventually went on to earn an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor for the role of John Coffey in the movie The Green Mile, based on a Stephen King story, and who also co-starred opposite Tom Hanks, and who also played the Kingpin in the Ben Affleck Daredevil movie, and was in the movies Armageddon, Sin City, and Talladega Nights, The Ballad of Ricky Bobby. The actor who sadly passed away in 2012 at the age of 54, Mr. Michael Clark Duncan. In any event, what the riot really showed was that public sentiment towards disco had quickly shifted. After that, disco died a quick death. At least the music that people called disco at that time did. If you were associated with disco like the Bee Gees, you became a laughingstock overnight and your career was dead. Another genre didn't become a hot new trend in America until New Wave came onto the scene in the early 1980s, thanks largely to the debut of MTV. New Wave was already relatively popular in the UK by the time America caught wind of it. Much like a villain in a 1980s horror movie franchise, however, disco only looked like it died. See, once it got booted from the mainstream, disco just went underground again and went back to the clubs in New York City and especially in Chicago, Illinois. DJs like Frankie Knuckles and Ron Hardy took major elements of it and made new music with it at clubs like the Warehouse in Chicago. They called the music house music, which was the name that club kids in Chicago called it when they went into the record stores looking for the music that was played at the Warehouse and just shortened the name to house. Then, three kids named the Belleville Three, Juan Atkins, Derek May, and Kevin Saunderson, took elements of the group Kraftwerk, combined it with disco, threw in a touch of rock and funk music, and created techno music in the clubs of Detroit, Michigan. Interesting how the two baseball teams were Chicago and Detroit, and the two places where disco ended up evolving were Chicago and Detroit. Go figure. House and techno hopped the pond to England and became a major part of the rave culture, especially in the 1990s, and then spread throughout Europe to places like Berlin and Amsterdam until it exploded just over a decade ago into the cultural force now known as EDM. Ironically, original disco artists like Chic and the Bee Gees are now popular again, with Chic selling out stadiums worldwide to this very day. Funny how the world works. However, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, it looked like disco was killed off for good, and while Steve Dahl and Gary Meyer didn't realize it, they in effect accomplished what they wanted to at that point. They put the final nail in the coffin of disco as people knew it back in the 1970s in the mainstream, and it all happened on Disco Demolition Night in Chicago, Illinois, on July 12th, 1979. Before we continue, we'd like to tell you about the Music History Today podcast, where we go over the events that happened on that particular day in music history. The Music History Today podcast drops every single day, including weekends, on this podcast network. Now, back to the Music History In-Depth podcast. This event is known as the biggest charity event ever held. It's also the template for using music as a fundraising tool. Live Aid has developed a mythical existence over the decades, mainly because of a few iconic performances. For those not in the know, Live Aid was not, I repeat, not the first charity benefit concert, even though some people would have you believe that. Charity concerts have been around forever. There was George Harrison's 1971 concert for Bangladesh, which was two concerts that were held in New York City to aid refugees from East Pakistan who were struggling after Tropical Cyclone Bola, and also the Bangladesh war genocide that occurred. There were the late 1970s and early 1980s Secret Policemen's Balls concerts, which aided the British unit of Amnesty International. Live Aid, though, has stood the test of time and become one of those Generation X time markers, let's say. How did it get to that point? Well, what we're going to do is go back, way back in the time. Okay, actually, just back to the mid-1980s, when a journalist did a story that planted a seed that made all the difference. Starting in 1983, journalist Michael Burke was reporting on a famine in the country of Ethiopia for BBC News. The famine was part of the Ethiopian Civil War that had been going on since Ethiopian head of state Mengistu Haile Mariam seized power in 1978 until he was finally overthrown in 1991. On October 23, 1984, the BBC put one of Michael's reports on the air that struck a chord worldwide. It was about a nurse for one of the relief agencies named Claire Berkshinger. Her unenviable task was to help decide which, out of over 85,000 people at a refugee camp, would get the aid that day. It was her job to put marks on children who would receive the aid that day and who would live, while the vast majority would not get marks and would soon die. A 1984 diary entry that she made while she was stationed at a feeding station said, quote, "There are thousands of people outside. I have counted 10 rows, and each row has more than 100 people in, and I can only take 60 to 70 children today, but they all need to come in." End quote. It traumatized her so much that she didn't talk about it for over 20 years, finally saying in an interview, quote, "I felt like a Nazi sending people to the death camps. Why was I in this situation? Why was it possible in this time of plenty that some have food and some do not? It is not right." End quote. For her part, Claire retired in 2024 from nursing. Michael Burke's report about Claire and the famine moved the British public so much that people started giving tons of money to organizations like Save the Children. The report was also shown in America, which was unheard of back in the 1980s, as a lot of British television did not make American airwaves. Remember, this was all before the internet. The report also moved one particular man into action. Back in the early 1980s, Bob Geldof was known for being the lead singer of the group the Boomtown Rats. Their big hit was the song "I Don't Like Mondays." On October 23, 1984, he and his then-wife, Paula Yates, were watching that BBC report on the Ethiopian famine and decided to raise money to help with relief efforts. Bob got on the phone and called his friend Midge Ure from the group Ultravox. They got together a bunch of their famous friends, and on November 25th, they recorded a charity single that they wrote that month called Do They Know It's Christmas, which was released on November 30th and went on to become one of the top 5 biggest selling singles of all time, raising over $8 million for famine relief. The time frame from the BBC report being shown to the song coming out was right around 5 weeks. The song also inspired USA for Africa's We Are the World, written by Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie. Among the artists who sang on Do They Know It's Christmas was Boy George of Culture Club. At the end of Culture Club's show on December 22, 1984 at Wembley Stadium, Boy George sang a version of the song with some celebrities on stage. Boy George was so overcome with emotion that he contacted Bob Geldof and suggested that there should be a charity concert being held. Bob already had the wheels to this idea turning in his own head. In a January 1985 interview with Melody Maker magazine, Bob said, quote, "The show should be as big as is humanly possible. There's no point in just 5,000 fans turning up at Wembley. We need to have Wembley linked with Madison Square Gardens." Wrong word, it's Garden, but whatever. And the whole show should be televised worldwide. It would be great for Duran to play 3 or 4 numbers at Wembley and then flick to Madison Square where Springsteen would be playing. And while he's on the Wembley stage, could be made ready for the next British act like the Thompsons or whoever. In that way, lots of acts could be featured and the television rights, tickets, and so on could raise a phenomenal amount of money. It's not an impossible idea and certainly one worth exploiting. End quote. By the way, the Thompsons he's referring to is the group the Thompson Twins, who were popular back then. Bob and Midge got to work. First, they hired promoter Harvey Goldsmith to do the Wembley concert and legendary promoter Bill Graham to do the American concert. Television producer Tony Verna got on board, and through his connections with Philadelphia's mayor, he secured Philly's John F. Kennedy Stadium for the event. Through his TV network connections, he got ABC Television to broadcast a 3-hour primetime live version of the American portion with tape-delayed British performances. Dick Clark hosted the American broadcast. MTV handled almost all of both concerts if you had cable, and not a lot of people did back then. But if you had it, then it was pretty much an all-day event for you. The way that Bob got a lot of the performers to do the shows was, well, okay, he lied to them. He would tell one guy that another guy was going to do the show, and then he'd get on the phone to the other guy and say that the first guy was going to do the show. They were also going to try to do a live duet between David Bowie in London and Mick Jagger in Philadelphia. However, with technology being what it was back in the day, they couldn't get the signals to sync up properly, so they completely abandoned that idea. Instead, they showed the music video of Bowie and Jagger's version of the Martha and the Vandellas hit song Dancing in the Streets and played it in both stadiums at the same time. The Wembley Stadium portion started at noon British time on July 13th, 1985 on the BBC with the words, quote, "It's 12 noon in London, 7 a.m. in Philadelphia, and around the world. It's time for Live Aid." End quote. The vast majority of it was heard in mono. You didn't watch it in stereo unless you were one of the fortunate ones who had an expensive stereo TV set. Remember, kids, this is 1985, mind you. If you were listening to it on the radio, then you got a stereo version. Also, the BBC version was commercial-free. The American version, on the other hand, was filled with commercials and commercials and commercials, and also interviews. So American audiences missed a bunch of performances, at least on ABC. Also, because some artists crossed over time-wise, certain acts like the reunion of Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young were not shown. The Wembley show opened with the British Army Regiment, the Coldstream Guards, opening with the Royal Salute, which is the short version of God Save the King, which at this moment in time was God Save the Queen, but that's neither here nor there. Prince, now King Charles, and the late great Princess Diana were at the stadium for the beginning of the concert. Status Quo was the first band on stage. They did 3 songs. Also, it was the last time that Status Quo's lineup played together, as they lost bassist Alan Lancaster and drummer Pete Kirscher right after that. The Style Council played 4 songs, including You're the Best Thing and Walls Come Tumbling Down. Then the Boomtown Rats, complete with Bob Geldof, played next, singing I Don't Like Mondays and 2 other songs. Adam Ant did the song Viva La Rock. Later on, he criticized Live Aid as, quote, the death of rock and roll, end quote. If only he knew the Macarena was coming. Now that was the death of rock and roll. Midge Ure's band, Ultravox, was up after that. By this time in his friendship with Geldof, Midge felt a little pushed aside by Bob. As to Midge, it seemed like Bob wanted to take over the whole Live Aid project and to take all the credit and spotlight for himself. They've since made up. Then Spandau Ballet came out and did their 3 biggest hits. It was during this point that the American concerts started. More on those performances later. Then Elvis Costello did a version of the Beatles song All You Need Is Love. Nick Kershaw came up and did 4 songs, including his hit single Wouldn't It Be Good. Sade performed 3 songs. Sting, Phil Collins, and saxophonist Branford Marsalis performed together and did 4 Sting songs and 2 Phil Collins songs. Phil's performance was unique. He performed at both concerts and became the first artist to play concerts in Europe and America on the same exact day. After he finished his performances, Phil got to the airport in a helicopter and took the British Airways Concorde over to America, landed at Kennedy Airport in New York City, and then took a helicopter from New York City to Philadelphia and performed a set at Kennedy Stadium. For those not in the know, the Concorde was fully operational at that time and flew supersonic. Flight time between New York City and London was around 4 hours. The plane wouldn't be taken out of commission until 2003, and surprisingly, there has not been supersonic commercial aviation since. Strange. There was also another person who Phil picked up for his ride from New York to Philly. On that Concorde flight was Cher, who was somehow, some way oblivious to the fact that Live Aid was going on. Apparently, this woman just did not watch television or read a newspaper, even a full 3 weeks before the event. After she saw Phil on the plane, she wanted in. She went to the concert, stood by the side of the stage and watched, and then got up on stage when they all sang We Are the World at the end of the concert. Meanwhile, back at Wembley, Howard Jones did the song Hide and Seek. And then Brian Ferry and David Gilmour came on stage and did 4 songs, including Slave to Love and his cover of John Lennon's song Jealous Guy, which is a really good version. Paul Young then came on stage and did 4 songs. The intro to Do They Know It's Christmas, since he sang the opening line in the song. The song That's the Way Love Is with Alison Moyet, along with Every Time You Go Away and Come Back and Stay, his 2 big hits. The first memorable performance happened next. In a set that still gets talked about to this day, U2 performed 2 songs for 30 minutes, Sunday Bloody Sunday and an extra-long performance of the song Bad, where Bono went into the crowd and danced with a fan in the front part of the stage pit. U2 were relatively famous at that point, coming off of popular albums War in 1983 and The Unforgettable Fire in 1984. They would become even more well-known after this performance and become superstars with the 1987 album The Joshua Tree. Dire Straits then came on and did Money for Nothing and Sultans of Swing. When Sting walked out on stage to sing on Money for Nothing, MTV VJ Nina Blackwood famously said on air, quote, "What is Sting doing out there?" End quote. completely forgetting for that moment that even though she had introduced the video to the song 1,000,000 times on that channel, Sting was the one who sang the famous lyrics, "I want my MTV" on the song, and he also co-wrote the song and was there to sing his lyrics live. After their set came the one part of Live Aid that everyone remembers, Queen, and the legend of the performance has only grown ever since. If you saw the movie Bohemian Rhapsody, then you already know what led up to the performance and what was at stake with Freddie Mercury's vocal cords and what a risk he was taking. As Tony Hedley of Spandau Ballet said before the performance, all of the bands were just going through the motions. Queen were the group who took the moment seriously and gave a performance that was at one time voted the single greatest performance in rock music history. I personally would have gone with Jimi Hendrix at Monterey, but whatever. Let's be fair to the quality of music for Live Aid for a minute. As Bob Geldof has stated in interviews very recently, the music was not the point of the concert, at least not to him. He got all of those acts there so that they could make money for his charity. That was the whole point to the thing to begin with. The fact that people still remember Queen and U2's performances is a testament to what great performers they are. They always give their best. They never go through the motions. Queen started with part of Bohemian Rhapsody, Radio Gaga with the crowd clapping in unison, the famous call and response with the crowd, Hammer to Fall, Crazy Little Thing Called Love, We Will Rock You, and We Are the Champions. 1.5 hour that can only be described as goosebumps. Donations to organizations that collected for famine relief shot up after Queen's performance. David Bowie had to follow that up, but really, he's Bowie, so you know he kept the magic going. He performed TVC 15, Rebel Rebel, Modern Love, and Heroes. Bowie was going to do the song 5 years. However, there was a music video that he wanted played on the broadcast that showed starving kids and was set to the Cars' hit song Drive. Bob Geldof said that there was no time on the schedule, so Bowie said that he would cut one of his songs out of his set in exchange for having that music video played. After that music video was played on air, donations really started pouring in. Then came The who did 4 songs and whose television feed cut out for a minute because of a blown fuse in the middle of My Generation, right as Roger Daltrey sang Why Don't You All Fade Away? Kind of apropos. Elton John did 6 songs, including Don't Go Breaking My Heart with Kiki D and Don't Let the Sun Go Down on Me with Wham, who strangely didn't do a set of their own music at the concert. Freddie Mercury and Brian May came back out to perform Is This the World We Created? Then Paul McCartney came out and performed Let It Be. Paul said that his management told him that he should do the concert, and by management he meant his kids. Organizers wanted a former Beatle to perform as they felt that it lent credit to the cause. After Paul finished, a bunch of performers sang Do They Know It's Christmas, and that was it. The British edition ended around 10 p.m. that night, 10 hours after it started. The American concert is the one that never seems to get talked about. We're not going to go over every set list like the British one because of that. We have, however, put the entire set list and start times for both the British and American concerts in the show notes if you want to check them out. We will note 4 things, though. First, a lot of British acts played in Philadelphia instead of London, like Eric Clapton, Duran Duran, Black Sabbath, Simple Minds, and Judas Priest. Second, there was a disastrous Led Zeppelin reunion with Phil Collins playing drums, which was so bad that when the concerts were issued on DVD, the band refused to allow their performance to be put on them. Therefore, if you didn't see it as it happened, you will never see it. At least not if Led Zeppelin continues to get their way. Phil Collins was blamed by Jimmy Page for how bad it was. Another group who also didn't want their performance to be shown is Santana, who also performed in Philly. Third, Run DMC was the only hip-hop act to perform there, as rap had not taken hold of the mainstream quite yet. It wasn't until the next year that they came out with the smash album Raising Hell, with, of course, the iconic song Walk This Way. They even referenced their Live Aid performance on that album with the classic song My Adidas, when they rapped, "I stepped on stage at Live Aid, all the people gave an applause that paid." We'll get back to them in a few minutes. Fourth, Phil Collins finished his record-breaking performance by doing his set again in Philadelphia. There were other performances on the broadcast that weren't in either London or Philadelphia. Organizers held events on the same day worldwide. The groups Loudness and Off Course, along with 4 other artists, performed 6 songs in a studio in Japan. The group Australia for Africa performed 1 song in Vienna. B.B. King performed 4 songs in The Hague, Netherlands. The group Why You Rock Messiah performed a song in Belgrade in what was once called Yugoslavia and is now called Serbia. Autograph did 2 songs in Moscow. Band for Africa did 2 songs in Cologne, West Germany. Scavenger for Africa and Ferente Artister performed 2 songs in Norway. Kool and the Gang did 2 songs in a studio. Cliff Richard, who couldn't perform live at Wembley due to a prior concert commitment, instead did a performance via videotape. There was also a full festival that was held on the same day in Sydney, Australia, called Oz for Africa. The headliners for that festival were Men at Work, who were extremely popular back then, In Excess just before they put out their late 1985 album Listen Like Thieves and then became superstars with the 1987 album Kick, and the Little River Band, who were already extremely popular in the 1970s in America, but somehow everybody forgot that they were actually an Australian band and not American. Go figure. The full set list and presenters for all of those worldwide performances are also in the show notes if you want to check them out. There were some criticisms of their performances. Aside from Led Zeppelin, Bob Dylan came under fire. During the intro to the song When the Ship Comes In, Bob said, quote, "I hope that some of the money that's raised for the people in Africa, maybe they can just take a little bit of it, maybe 1 or 2 million maybe, and use it, say, to pay the mortgages on some of the farms that the farmers here owe to the banks." End quote. Dylan caught a lot of heat for suggesting that and later apologized for it, saying that it wasn't the time or place to say something like that. But while the comment was criticized, it did plant an idea in the heads of John Mellencamp, Willie Nelson, and Neil Young to start the Farm Aid charity concerts to help American farmers. Some artists like Tears for Fears, Culture Club, Huey Lewis and the News, Deep Purple, Prince, Michael Jackson, and Bruce Springsteen either didn't think it was a worthy enough event to be a part of, Tears for Fears, Bruce Springsteen, Ritchie Blackmore of Deep Purple, Huey Lewis and the News, didn't want to appear in person but donated songs or videos, Culture Club and Prince, were busy with prior commitments, Michael Jackson, Cliff Richard, were sick, Annie Lennox of Eurythmics actually had a throat infection and couldn't sing at all, or were upset at not being invited to play, Rush, Thin Lizzy, and Roger Waters, who was invited but only if he put Pink Floyd back together. He actually did end up putting Pink Floyd back together at least for one performance during one of the subsequent sequels to Live Aid. It was either Live Earth or Live 8. I believe it was Live 8, about 20 years after the fact. For those artists, doing shows for free just really wasn't their thing, regardless of whether it was serving the common good or not. Still others, like Adamant and BBC presenter Andy Kershaw, were at Live Aid, but later criticized the entire thing. One artist that Geldof was upset about showing up to the play was the Philadelphia hometown band, the Hooters, whose breakthrough album Nervous Night came out 3 months earlier and had the hit songs All You Zombies and the song And We Danced, both in the top 10, and had snagged the opening slot in America. Geldof didn't think they were popular enough. Go figure. Ironically, Bob Geldof opened up for the Hooters during a tour in 2004, so yeah. Funny how the world works. There was also criticism that while there were a lot of black performers at the American concert, only Sade was there in London. One would have figured that a more diverse lineup would have been good, especially if the concerts were to benefit a country in Africa. This criticism would be leveled against Geldof and crew again 20 years later when organizers were announcing the lineup for the 2005 Live 8 concert, which also had only one black performer, at least at the time of the announcements. There were also accusations that funds were not going to relief groups but to Ethiopian government officials. Indeed, some money that was alleged to have gone to buy guns for the authoritarian government, and also there were accusations that food and medical supplies did not go to starving people but rather to parts of the population that supported the government. The more things change, the more they stay the same. History doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. In any event, there was a 4-disc DVD set that came out in late 2004. Aside from Led Zeppelin and Santana, other artists were cut from the DVD release for whatever reason. Artists like Rick Springfield, the Hooters, Billy Ocean, Kool and the Gang, the Four Tops, and the Power Station. Still others had parts of their sets cut, like Madonna, who had a song cut. Some had parts re-recorded. For instance, Paul McCartney had microphone issues during his original performance of Let It Be. Being the smart performer that he is, and figuring that the event would come out on some format at some time in the future, Paul went into a studio 2 weeks after Live Aid and re-recorded his part of the song. The version on the DVD is the studio version. Also, Live Aid started their own YouTube channel, and you can watch some of the performances there, including a few that did not make the DVD cut, like Kool and the Gang's performance of their song Cherish, along with interviews and backstage stuff. It also had a good chunk of the international performances, and we will also throw that link to it in the show notes as well, because there's some really good stuff on there. And I believe they've also now added Live 8 and Live Earth concerts to that channel. Regardless of the criticism of the concerts or where the funds from the concert were going, the shows did do a lot of good. They raised over $150 million for famine relief. You can argue about whether it went to the right place or not. You can argue about whether the performances were any good or not. You can argue whether the whole event was just Bob Geldof's ego rung amok. What you can't argue is that Live Aid influenced other charity concerts and events such as Comic Relief and Farm Aid. It spawned the quote-unquote sequels Live 8 in 2005 and Live Earth in 2007. Plus, it stood the test of time and become one of the most memorable concert events in pop culture history. Will something like Live Aid ever happen again? To be honest, I'm not sure. It was a different time back then, different circumstances, different political factions. And while there are festivals, including the yearly Global Citizen Concert in Central Park every summer in New York City that draw attention to certain issues, I'm not sure that anyone these days, except for maybe a global company like Live Nation, could or would even attempt to do an event that has worldwide contributions and is for a good cause. Plus, the world seems to be veering into a far-right society, especially in Europe and America, where people can't even agree on lunch, let alone on helping people who are less fortunate. So, I'm not sure that the right dedication is there at the moment. I could be wrong. I certainly hope I'm wrong anyway. The legendary, iconic concert event that was Live Aid, held in London, England, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, on July 13th, 1985. There was something else that happened this week in music history, but we're going to talk about this in 2 weeks when the group Cream played their first show together. For now, we will just briefly mention that on July 16th, 1966, the group Cream was formed. Now, on to this week's birthday. This week's birthday is a singer whose 2 biggest hits were from the same album, although the hits were 3 years apart. This artist was born on July 11th, 1959 in Santa Monica, California. Her parents divorced after her birth. Her mom remarried and moved to New York City. She went to the New York High School for the Performing Arts, or as it's more popularly known as, the Fame School, especially after the hit movie and TV series back in the 1980s. After high school, she went to college for English literature, but she also performed in the small Greenwich Village cafes and bars. It was at the Cornelia Street Cafe that she got her big break. She was a contributor to the Monday Night Songwriting Group. She also hooked up with the Fast Folk record label, and it was from this that she got her major record deal. Her debut album did pretty well, both with the critics and the general public, although it was more popular over in England than here in America. She also had a minor hit overseas with the song Left of Center with Joe Jackson off of the Pretty in Pink soundtrack. Now, normally, when your first album does well, you suffer from the sophomore jinx on your next album. Her second album actually did even better. It garnered her 2 hits. The first, released in 1987, was about a child named Luca. It went on to get 3 Grammy Award nominations, including Record and Song of the Year, losing Record of the Year to Paul Simon's Graceland and Song of the Year to Linda Ronstadt and James Ingram's Somewhere Out There from the animated movie An American Tail. Her second hit off that album had a strange story all its own. An a cappella version of the song was originally written in 1982. It's based on a place at the corner of Broadway and West 112th Street in New York City. That place would also become famous for being featured all the time on a television show about nothing. In 1987, it was released on one of the Fast Folk record label albums. Later that year, the song was featured on her own album. The a cappella version of the song, however, went absolutely nowhere. About 3 years later, the dance producers DNA took the song, put a funky, slow dance beat to it, and released it on their own, all without her consent. Her record label could have sued DNA for copyright infringement. Instead, they bought the song from DNA and released it as her own single. The dance remix became her biggest hit. It's also because of the a cappella version of the song that she is known as the mother of the MP3, for it was this song that German scientist Karl-Heinz Brandenburg and audio engineers used in order to test the bit rates of the MP3 format while they were developing it. These days, she's an activist. She still writes songs, puts out albums, and does concerts in small venues. However, she will be known for her 2 hits off of her 1987 sophomore album, Solitude Standing. And if you listen to those 80s hits channels on your radio streams, then you've probably heard the song about the child named Luca, who lived on the 2nd floor, who lived upstairs from you. Thinks you may have seen him before. Great song, by the way. Doesn't get enough airplay. As for the song that made her known as the mother of the MP3, the DNA remixed version is all over your 90s music streams. The exterior of its subject matter was featured every week on that television show about nothing, better known these days as Seinfeld. It's actually known as Tom's Restaurant. The song is called Tom's Diner. Happy birthday to singer-songwriter, and mother of the MP3, Miss Suzanne Vega, born July 11th, 1959. And that is it for a supersized version of the Music History In-Depth podcast for July 10th through the 16th. We had to go supersize. I mean, Disco Demolition Night and Live Aid are iconic in pop culture history, so we had to say everything about them. Matter of fact, we'll probably split them up and do them as their own segments so that you can just listen to it without listening to the entire thing. Oh, too late, you already have. And I thank you for that, especially if you're watching on YouTube and or Spotify. Thank you very, very much. Catch you next week.